Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast. On today's episode, we have a special guest, Mr. Mick West. Mick is probably best known for his work on the investigation and debunking of claims related to condensation trails created by airplanes, also known as chemtrails. Although he's been involved in the skeptical analysis of other conspiratorial claims over the years. He runs metabunk.org and contrailscience.com currently, has previously run morgellonswatch.com, has been featured on the Joe Rogan Show and podcast, gave a talk on chemtrails at the Center for Skeptical Inquiry Con this past October, and has been featured as a science writer and debunker in various places over the years. He's also one of the founders of Neversoft Entertainment, which famously made the Tony Hawk series of skateboarding games. He's been gracious enough to accept my offer to come on the air here and talk to me about his work as a debunker, a skeptic, and kind of the state of the conspiracy world today. Welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast. Today's episode, an interview with Mick West. Well, so tell me a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, my deep background, I guess, is that I used to be a video game programmer. I spent a number of years of my life programming video games, and then I kind of semi-retired from that a few years ago, and I started doing other stuff, just like I was writing for Game Development Magazine. And around that time, this is like about 10 years ago, I guess, I started getting interested in doing some debunking, scientific skepticism type stuff. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got into it at first just doing things on Wikipedia. And then I got interested in a few different topics and started writing various blog posts about them. And it just kind of something I've been doing ever since. Sure.
Yeah, I really liked... So you run Metabunk and Contrail Science and also Morgellons Watch, which is what actually brought me to asking you to be on the show. But I really like on Metabunk, you give this history of your time debunking. And you talk about when you were a kid, how you had a book that you read that kind of scared you, right? And then learning more about the paranormal, it was a paranormal story. And so learning more about it kind of changed that.
It was something that, as a young child, it was very frightening to me. It's a famous UFO story where this couple in a farm hear something and they go outside and they see this thing with big eyes staring at them and then claws reaching towards them, and then they see some light somewhere and they assume that it was like aliens.
Yeah.
And the fact that to me as a young child, I don't know how old I was, maybe 12 or so, I found the fact that aliens existed because I read it in a book, and that they might come at you with claws in the middle of the night to be a very, very frightening thing.
Sure.
But then later I discovered that story was basically almost certainly these farmers being a bit drunk and having seen an owl flying towards them.
Right.
And that was quite a relief to me. And then, when you find out things have a more mundane explanation, it makes you wonder what other things also have more mundane explanations. And I just kind of got interested in figuring out what the explanations of things are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny actually reading that. It reminded me. So I actually had pretty much a very similar, I guess, sort of beginning in this sort of field where I had a book. I still have the book actually, and it's called Mysteries of the Unexplained. It's like this big kind of like encyclopedia on spooky stories and weird things and whatever. And I remember one of them that really scared me was the Flatwoods Monster, which is this UFO case that happened in West Virginia. And I remember going and for a long time as a kid, I was so scared. I was like, I'm not going to learn about it. I'm not going to read anything else. Don't look at the pictures, whatever. And then over time, as I got older, you research these things and you come to find, well, they're not really that scary. And I think it's sort of an interesting, I wonder sometimes if that isn't kind of how a lot of skeptics get, skeptics or debunkers or whatever you want to call people in kind of our, I don't know.
I think,
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that is actually a fairly common story, that people were actually interested in this type of thing when they were younger. Like they were interested in UFOs, for example, or they were interested in the paranormal, ghost stories. And also, a lot of them were people who grew up in religious families.
Yes.
Like I was raised Catholic, which is in itself a kind of a belief in the paranormal in a way. Religion is kind of, it's different in that it's much more acceptable to believe in religion. But if you look at some of the things, obviously the story of the resurrection and the transubstantiation, like this, which is where the host is supposed to turn into the body of Christ. Things like that are essentially paranormal things. And when people lose their religion and they for whatever reason they stop being religious, I think there's sometimes a bit of a reaction. And they grew up believing all this stuff, which was essentially magic from where they are, from their perspective now. And so it gives them a kind of literally a skeptical view of the world. Like, is everything that I have been told true or not? Right? Is everything that I'm reading true or not? And, you start being more suspicious about things and not accepting things on face value and actually looking into them more.
Right. Yeah. I actually think I often, so I love looking at these things from sort of a philosophy of science or, kind of a sociology sort of view, right? Where there's this whole idea that these kind of conspiracy theories or these belief in irrational kind of things or things that aren't really provable they ebb and flow, right? So there's always this talk every couple of years about an occult revival or a conspiracy revival in the United States. And I often wonder, if you look back at the history, there's really no evidence that it's a revival. It's sort of something that's always been there. But I think what you just said was really interesting about the religious background, right? So I was raised Catholic as well. And I often wonder if having that kind of structured or very, so this, you look to what the Pope says, or you look to what the church proper says, right? Versus say in America, where there's this feeling of, I don't know, religion, I feel like in the United States is very democratic in many ways. There's so many offshoots.
Lots of small churches where it's very personal.
Exactly. And so even your view into these mysteries becomes subjective as opposed to objective. And I wonder sometimes if that's not part of the reason why the United States has such seemingly a thriving conspiracy or, ghost hunting kind of society. But I don't know. I mean,
I think that's a good possibility if you think about how people respond to authority. Mm-hmm. When I grew up in England, and I respected authorities. Like if I read something in the encyclopedia, I thought it was true. And the church was the church, and whatever the church said was true. And there wasn't that much variety. Like in England, we had 3 channels of TV, and we had maybe 2 different types of church. We had, the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church, and maybe there's some others, but I'd never heard of them. Whereas you come to America and you have all these different churches, strange churches, which strange to my mind, like the Mormons.
Right.
And I had no idea that they have some very, very strange beliefs from my perspective as an English person.
Sure.
And, even stranger things like Scientology, but that's just getting way out there. But also, America had a lot more TV channels as well. So there's this diversity of opinions and diversity of authorities, I think, that characterizes the American experience to a certain degree as being different from the British experience.
So one thing that's often, it was actually something that you had mentioned as well in a I think you were on Joe Rogan's TV show. And you were discussing contrails and how they form. So one thing with contrails that I think is very funny. So I'm trained as a chemical engineer, and one of the problems that we give to kind of second year chemical engineering students is calculating the necessary flow around an airplane wing to cause condensation. right? So we give that problem of, what Reynolds, we use the Reynolds number, which is this dimensionless constant for flow. But I always think it's very funny that it's kind of something that is taught in university, right? This kind of, obviously it's simplified down to the point where you can solve it analytically, but still this, I always think that's kind of funny. Whenever I hear about chemtrails, I'm like, well, I give that problem in class and it's not the way you think it is, But
the one you were talking about there, the flow over a wing is just one of the two types of contrails. The more common one is actually the one that comes from the engines of a plane, which is the caused by the water in the exhaust.
So it's not actually it's not actually like the eddies around the wingtip. It's
no, that does. There's a type of contrail called an aerodynamic contrail, and another one called an exhaust contrail. And the fact that there are these two different types of contrails just confuses the science.
Sure.
And that means that people who believe in conspiracy theories, if they see the science as being a bit confusing, then they're much more likely to reject it out of hand.
Right.
And the science is actually relatively complicated.
Sure.
Even stuff like, if you drop the pressure of a gas, then the relative humidity increases. That's meaningless gobbledygook to most people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, even though you could say, oh yeah, we teach that at university, they're like, well, so what? The university is funded by the government, and they just teach a bunch of lies there.
Right. Well, that's actually the part that I think is so fascinating, right? So the thing that you had mentioned, we kind of went off on a tangent there, but the thing that you had mentioned was that there's a chemtrails is almost a gateway drug to other conspiracies, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we find. I've found, at least in now, so I've been doing this show for only 8 months, say, but I've had a lifelong interest, and I help with another show doing research for them and providing kind of a scientific side to things. But one thing I've found is there's this very concerted effort, or this desire for everything to fit within one worldview, right? So contrails are part of, what was that one? Jade Helm, right? It's part of the government trying to turn us into effeminate zombies or whatever it is that they think. Yeah. I was wondering if you could, how. So this is. I originally contacted you because of Morgellons. So I was wondering, how did you get from that field to chemtrails, and also how do you think chemtrails fits in with the whole just kind of medical irrational medical fears or bad medical knowledge that's out there in general?
Yeah, I think like you said, there is this desire for everything to fit together, and one of the things about being a conspiracy theorist is that if you believe one conspiracy theory, you have to believe every other conspiracy theory that is at least as plausible as that conspiracy theory. Like, if you believe in, say, the moon landings being faked, then everybody who believes that the moon landings have been faked will also believe that JFK was assassinated by the CIA or something like that. But they won't necessarily believe that the Queen is a reptile from another dimension. But if you do believe the Queen is a reptile from another dimension, then you pretty much are going to believe everything. So there's this kind of spectrum of beliefs. But people automatically want to have consistency in their beliefs. So if they have something that is not consistent, then they'll just kind of change their beliefs, or they'll gloss over it. Excuse me. So with chemtrails and Morgellons, those are kind of related in a way. I would say Morgellons in a way is less ridiculous than chemtrails, because the Morgellons is essentially people thinking that they have some kind of disease. Which is, a reasonable belief. Whereas chemtrails is the belief that the government is spraying chemicals out of the air in this huge conspiracy that's been covered up by the entirety of science and journalism and meteorology, and every country in the world is in on the thing, and they've been doing it for 50 years. And it's basically the biggest thing ever, which is a much bigger conspiracy. So people who believe in chemtrails, quite are likely to be able to believe in things like the Morgellons disease. But it's interesting that the origin of the chemtrail theory was kind of based on health concerns. People were concerned about what's actually in these trails that they were seeing in the sky. People noticed contrails, they hadn't really been paying attention before, and then they see them for the first time and think, what the heck is that? And then the next obvious thing to ask is, like, what is it doing to my health? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a certain type of conspiracy theorist who tends to have a kind of a hypochondria. Mm-hmm. They're very concerned about their health. Now, I wouldn't say that Morgellons' belief is that type of thing exactly, because the people who believe they have Morgellons generally do actually have something wrong with them. Like, they will have some condition that is leading to their itching or their skin or even like their mental health issues. Like, they might have depression or forgetfulness or something like that. So there is actually something there, but there is definitely a type of person, like a hypochondriac type person who kind of views the world through that lens of their own health. Mm-hmm. And that really affects how they fall for certain types of conspiracies over others. Like, there's the water fluoridation thing, where they think that people are disposing of toxic waste in the water supply, or they're trying to do it to dumb people down or something. People who are in that vein of thinking will be more likely to believe that particular type of conspiracy. Right.
But I think that's another great point, though, that was brought up in the this was actually on the podcast with Joe Rogan that you did. I actually watched it on YouTube the other day, where he mentions that there's, okay, let's say that you have this conspiratorial mindset. You think maybe we shouldn't be trusting everything that the science and the government says about whatever, fluoridation or anything. But then they don't investigate things that are really going on, right? I find that fascinating when, you'll go on to Reddit, say, and, you can spend hours on the conspiracy, subreddits and whatever, and they're talking still about Pizzagate, right? And not talking about an effort by, big petrochemical companies to keep carbon dioxide flowing to the atmosphere, or, there are these interesting or historical ways that say, the environment has been polluted, or science has been curbed in interesting ways to try to fit a narrative. But we don't, those are considered to be, I don't know. I think there's an interesting slant now towards conspiracies having almost a right-wing view in American culture, at least. And I think, of course it'll sway back, right? I think that's partially because of 8 years of a liberal president. But it'll be, I always find that very fascinating to see the difference when you say something like, well, okay, so you believe in water fluoridation. What about global warming? And they say, well, no, global warming's a myth. Well,
yeah, well, they think of that as being an actual conspiracy. I think that people do. I can't remember. What was the question? What was the question again?
It's fine. No, so it was. It was. Well, basically, just sort of what I guess.
All right. Yeah. The real conspiracies versus like fake conspiracies
ones,
in a way. Yeah. So I think in a way the fake conspiracies are the more interesting ones to the person, and they're easier to get into. If you look at Pizzagate, for example, it's this ridiculous reading into of things from these emails of John Podesta and some other people, and it's kind of like an amazing story if you take every fifth word and change it into something else, something will come out. If you take every reference to pizza and replace it with child, and every reference to hot dog and replace it with I don't know what the term would be.
Yeah.
like, something an interesting story will come out, but there's really nothing there. But it sounds really interesting,
right?
But if you compare that against, like, what did ExxonMobil do in the 1980s regarding global warming, then you're going to have to read through reams and reams of boring memos and scientific research, and it's just not as accessible.
Right.
And if you look at things like the chemtrail conspiracy theory, you can actually go out of your house and look up in the sky and say, "Look at that trail."
Right,
and
I found
this,
one.
like, supposed evidence of this nefarious conspiracy, and these things are just the sexier in a way, like the World Trade Center collapse. Like, people say that was destroyed by explosives, and the primary evidence that they give was that it looks really weird.
Right, because we have so much experience with we have so much experience with planes flying into buildings that
the 110-story building collapsing from the top down isn't something you see very often. It's not something that's ever happened before. And the actual description of what happened was something that was basically new to science, but people use that novelty as an argument, and it's an easy argument to make. You say, "Oh, that looked really weird. It doesn't look like what I would have expected."
Right.
And that's all the evidence they really need.
Yeah, I'm always struck. Whenever I think about this, I'm reminded of one of my cousins. I'll never forget the day that he was told that Santa Claus didn't exist. He just flat out refused to believe it. Right, so his mother came down and sat him down and was like, Santa doesn't exist. It's been, mommy and daddy buying the presents. And he was like, well, why would everyone lie? Like, I don't believe you. He just flat out refused. And so sometimes I wonder, it kind of gets to that question of, well, how do you get someone to stop believing a conspiracy theory or something that's, I
think that illustrates a very big problem in conspiracy theories, is that people actually perhaps not literally, but they want to believe, and they kind of have to believe in a way because they have this internal desire for consistency in their thought processes. And if you take one thing away from their belief system, then it's possible that everything is going to collapse. Now, you might think it would be easy to just look at people's basis for belief and then explain to them one bit at a time why their belief is wrong. But it's usually very, very difficult to even make the slightest headway and even get them to accept that one thing might not be wrong. Because they feel that if you can debunk one thing, then everything is going to collapse.
Right.
If they stop believing in one conspiracy theory, they're going to have to stop believing in all of them. If they find out the chemtrails aren't real, then that might mean that, well, maybe the World Trade Center just collapsed from the fire and the plane impacts. So you get this thing called the backfire effect,
right?
Where if you explain to somebody why their beliefs are wrong, you quite often end up with them believing those things even stronger than before. And that's, I think, because people, when something is explained to someone that they're wrong, they've kind of got a mental choice they can make. They can either accept the facts that you're telling them, or they can push back against them and say, "Oh, that must be wrong. There must be some reason why you're lying to me." And that is just going to reinforce their belief even more, because now they've got some evidence that you are trying to cover up whatever they were believing before. So it makes it worse, essentially.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm struck by that kind of idea has become very popular recently because of the politics in the United States. Right, where you have I love following on Twitter Trump regrets, where it's these people who have, realized that things maybe aren't going to work out so well for them, or, things have been changed for them in some way. And, I think part of that is part of the debate has been, well, what do you do if someone comes up to you and says, well, I made a mistake. or I didn't, have all the facts before, even though you were trying to tell me or whatever, how do you then deal with that person after the fact? Do you welcome them with open arms? Do you, question or keep digging so that, you know what I mean? Like you can kind of get to the bottom of the misbelief or the error in judgment, I guess you would say. And I think in part of, politics, obviously it's a very subjective sort of thing, but in questions of, say, global warming being true or not, or the reality of carbon dioxide absorbing, ultraviolet radiation differently, or rather infrared radiation differently than other molecules in the upper atmosphere, those things have objective truth to them. There's a fact there, and it's difficult to, I guess it's difficult to know how to deal with those people and kind of get them to see the truth. So, I think that's part of the hope of this show, I suppose, and I'm sure part of the hope of you, doing the debunking work that you do, is to show people the truth. But I wonder if, it isn't more basic than that. I wonder if maybe it's a problem of people. I often wonder how many people have really met someone who is a scientist or an engineer or a doctor or something in their daily life when they're not just being told what to do by one of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's something I've discovered after doing this for a while is that it's a very slow process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something where you can just explain things to people and then they will understand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you bring a scientist and have a scientist try to explain something to a believer, it's generally not going to help. It's a very, very long and slow process.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of a misconception I had when I started writing about various things, doing this debunking. I kind of thought that, I can see what mistakes these people are making. And what I'll do is I'll just write a blog and I'll explain to them what the mistakes are.
Right.
Like for example, with chemtrails, I could see that people were making the mistake of thinking that contrails can't persist. So they can't spread out and can't last a long time in the sky. So I thought, that's a mistake. All these books and things explain that they can, so I'll just write about that. And so I wrote a post about that. It was my very first post on chemtrails.
Mm-hmm.
And that was nearly 10 years ago now. And people are still thinking the exact same thing.
Right.
So even though it's a very, very simple thing, like can contrails persist? And it's very straightforward. All these books say, yes, they can.
Mm-hmm.
People will still think that they can't. And partly that is because they haven't read all this information. Mm-hmm. But even when you show it to them, a lot of them will say, this is fake, or this is just nonsense, or it doesn't mean anything. Have you seen the show Westworld?
I have not. It's on my list of things to do once I get my PhD. As soon as I graduate, I'm going to watch Westworld. Yeah.
There's a scene in that. There's no spoilers there.
Sure,
but,
okay.
You know, there's robots in Westworld,
yes.
And they're programmed, obviously, to act like people. And in one scene, a human shows a robot a picture of something that the robot should know nothing about. And even though this robot acts exactly like a real person, they show him this photograph and they say, what do you see here? And the response is, it doesn't look like anything to me. And they're showing a picture of something that a normal person should understand. And that really struck me as something that it seems almost like this kind of thought blindness that people have when you try to explain something to them. Yeah, I think sometimes perhaps I'm not explaining things very well, but other times I'm saying, look, here is a book that says contrails can persist. Right. And they're just, doesn't look like anything to me. Right.
Yeah, I refuse. Yeah. That's very, yeah. Yeah, I think there is a bit of that in there, right? Where, well, I wonder too, so we kind of, with Morgellons, say, I think there is a very big part of it. We had spoken via email, right, when I first asked if you'd like to be on the show, about how there was almost a desire to believe anything but that there may be a psychological component to whatever is ailing you, right? So these people maybe are suffering from something like, a delusional parasitosis, or it could be, it could be something as simple as just an anxious tic, right? And they would rather it be a unknown and wide-ranging conspiracy than it being, something as simple as, well, if you take an anti-anxiety medicine, you'll probably stop picking your skin. I wonder if there isn't a part of that there as well, that to think that, in fact, it is something wrong with your cognitive, maybe not cognitive function, say, but that, your senses, your consciousness is actually, tricking you or doing you wrong in this instance, is much scarier to people than thinking that other people are trying to do them wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's actually a couple of things going on there. One is that people rejecting that there might be some mental component, but there's also people wanting a diagnosis. Now, in medicine, with things like itching, often if you go to a doctor and you say like, "Oh, my skin's itching," they might have no idea, and they might do some tests and they might not find anything. And I think I read that somewhere around like 1/3 of all cases of itching presented to a doctor are not identified, don't have an identified cause. And people are unhappy with that. They think that if they go to the doctor should be able to tell them what is wrong with them. They want like this very specific, concrete cause that they can then take some drugs for. If they're told like oh, you're just itching, so take this anti-itching cream, and then the itching gets worse, or they end up like obsessing over finding fibers on their skin, and then they're going to think, oh well, then these fibers are the explanation, and because the doctor didn't give them an explanation, and they find this explanation on their skin, they prefer saying that here's the cause of my illness.
Right.
They really want to. Yeah, they want to have an actual cause and not just, it be some kind of mysterious thing that's going on.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm often struck by I find this more, at least, so, Morgellons was a very interesting thing for me to kind of look into, but, one of my favorite topics in this kind of field is people that believe that they have, I guess, a ghost or something in their house. And then they, maybe it's something simple like, the cabinet shake or something or whatever, or it can be as serious as, well, my son, my son or daughter is having nightmares every night and whatever. And it kind of builds and builds until, they go to see doctors, and the doctor's like, well, I don't know, why don't you go see a therapist or something? And then it turns out, so instead of that, they'll go to see, these doctors can't help me. I'm going to go talk to a paranormal team or something. But, they skipped over that step, which was, well, why don't you go see a therapist or go to, you know what I mean? Try to find some kind of other explanation. And I think, I think it's partially, at least for me, I often think that it's just partially a misunderstanding of, again, like you were saying, how medicine happens and how prevalent and how serious kind of, I guess, somatic concerns, how serious being a hypochondriac could actually get, to the point of you thinking, well, I don't know, you know what I mean? I have fibers growing out of my skin, or I have I have a demon residing in my home or something.
Yeah, it's like there's quite often a fairly mundane explanation, and at some point people reject the mundane explanation. Like for example, with the poltergeist type things, if it's a child involved, it's usually just the child playing tricks on the parents.
Yeah, they want
like,
attention.
Yeah, and you stick a hidden camera in their room, and you'll see that the cup did not jump off the shelf. In fact, the child got out of bed and threw it. So there's this mundane explanation. But people, once they have skipped over that mundane explanation and they start going into the more complex and less scientific explanations, it's quite difficult, I think, for them to go back.
Yeah.
Like with with the poltergeist type things, the parents trust their children.
Mm-hmm.
So they say, "Oh, my little Jimmy would never lie. So, he must be telling the truth about what's going on. So it must be some kind of supernatural thing."
Right.
So once they've they've gone down that road, they kind of get stuck in that, and it becomes harder and harder for them to accept the less interesting explanation.
Right. I wish my parents had that trust me as a kid. Chris would never steal the cookies or something, right? He's too good a kid. It must have been a ghost. So I'm wondering, kind of as I guess a final thought. So I, like I said, started this podcast as in the hope of, I guess, spreading scientific awareness and, debunking, I guess, in some ways things. But I'm wondering if there are, how would you suggest someone who's interested in promoting, I guess, science or rationality or skeptical inquiry get involved in this field?
Well, it kind of depends on what your area of expertise are and what your knowledge is.
Mm-hmm.
I think like everybody can play a part in just simply talking to people
Mm-hmm.
where they see things that are wrong. Like one thing I do is I am a member of a few Facebook groups, just like local Facebook groups.
Mm-hmm.
And if I see a meme being posted that is incorrect, I will explain that to people. You can help simply spread the correct explanations around. You don't have to be a scientist and go in and investigate all these things yourself. A lot of the stuff that I do is just looking stuff up on Google
Mm-hmm.
and seeing what the real thing is. Like if I see some meme that says like I don't know, like ibuprofen is toxic. I'll look at the source of that and see if it's true or not, and then I'll explain to the person that that it wasn't true.
Right.
So, but if you're an actual, if you've got a bit more scientific knowledge or some mathematical knowledge, then one thing you could do is look at the Wikipedia pages and contribute via editing pages on Wikipedia that aren't perhaps the highest of quality.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the stuff on whatever paranormal or conspiracy theories. If you can just go and correct stuff on Wikipedia or make it more accessible, I think that's is a great way of contributing. There's actually a project on Wikipedia, the Guerrilla Skeptics on Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. Which is a group of people who will edit articles on Wikipedia from the skeptical point of view. Like they will edit, say, articles on homeopathy or alternative medicine or other things like alternative science theories, like the electrical view of the universe or whatever. And they've got to edit those articles with good references to the actual standards of Wikipedia. And taking part in something like that is a very valuable thing. Yeah. Some people will also like start their own blogs and podcasts, which is also good. But you got to realize that it takes a while to get things like that going.
Sure. Yeah.
If you're not going to do it for the long term, then you may as well not bother. You'd be better off either working with somebody else or doing things like the Wikipedia things. Because a lot of people will start a blog and they'll make 2 posts and then they'll just forget about it because it is a lot of work to keep going.
Sure.
And similarly with podcasts, I'm sure, as you know, it's initially you don't get very much back from it because you've got to build an audience, and so you can't expect to suddenly become this great debunker and have everybody listen to you. Like I've been doing it for a long time, and I still don't get that much traffic on my sites.
Yeah, great. Well, all right. So, thank you so much for coming on and agreeing to talk to me.
You're welcome.
This is, again, everyone, this is Mick West. You can find him on metabunk.org and contrailscience.com. I got the endings of those right.
That's right. But,
good.
They both work either way.
Yep. Okay. Phenomenal. And where else can people find you online?
Metabunk is where I spend most of my time now. I used to do the Morgellons Watch blog, but I kind of haven't really been updating that because not a lot has really been happening in the world of Morgellons.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Great. Okay, cool. So, well, thank you again so much.
You're welcome.
And that's the end of this episode. I just wanted to thank again Mick West for deciding to come on the air to talk with me. Not a huge podcast at this point, as I'm sure all of you guys listening know. And so getting the help, or at least having someone of his kind of level in this field reach out, really makes it a lot easier to kind of get a footing and also to feel included in this world that, I think is really important for a lot of people to become included in. Our world is becoming more and more fractured, sort of driven more on partisan kind of lines, I guess. And so it's getting harder and harder to see what the truth of something really is. Depending on what news station you watch, you'll hear that story A is true, story B is false. You'll get differing views on the same exact pieces of information. And so I think it's really important that people sit down and think about these things for themselves. Sit with your family members and discuss the news, discuss facts, discuss science, right? Try to find out what you actually believe. Are the things that you believe consistent overall with your whole world, right? And obviously there are some things that we can't really say too much about, right? As Wittgenstein said. But there are always pieces where there is truth to the matter, right? Our powers of science and empirical thinking have really helped us a lot in our modern world. And so to just kind of throw them away, right? There's this really funny thing I keep seeing online all the time that says, it's not reals, it's feels. Just basing your belief on something because it makes you feel good. Probably not the right way to go. And so I think the work of people like Mick West, and hopefully the work of this show, has a really, I don't want to say important because, my show isn't really that huge yet or anything. But you yourself can go out and promote scientific ideas. You yourself can go out and support rationalism. You can ask your friends, well, why do you believe that thing? Is there any proof for it? Can you send me some facts? Can you get me a source, a really good source? A lot of these things, a lot of these questions we have, we can answer for ourselves. And so I think it's really important and a really cool thing that we can actually just go out and do that with the power of the internet. The music this week comes from Berg, spelled B-H-R-G, which you can find on SoundCloud.com. This type of music is called chiptune, which is inspired by 80s video games, which I think is really cool. So it kind of uses a lot of lo-fi 8-bit sounds and stuff. And so this specific artist here, Berg, uses Nintendo Entertainment System sounds, which are really awesome. Anyways, you can find his stuff at soundcloud.com/BurgerKing, spelled B-H-R-G-E-R-K-I-N-G. This song is called Danger Meat.